So how do we get rid of it? What do we do?
Well, there's a lot of things you can do. Dietary changes and some things to kill the yeast and put in the good bacteria is the foundation. And what we often find is it takes about 3 months. But the steps to treatment are not that complex. If it's white, don't bite it for a while. And for example, a lot of folks will come in and they'll say, "Gosh, I have a lot of reflux," and I'm thinking to myself, in 3 months, you're going to almost certainly be telling me you don't have heartburn anymore. The people coming in on purple pill medications, good chance once they do this, wow, I feel so much better. I've come to see, the rashes, the eczemas, folks who have a lot of allergies. I'm coming to expect those folks to come back and say, my skin is significantly better. Or folks with autoimmune problems. Wow, I feel better. And I mean, I know people have a hard time believing that getting the gut healthy can do this much. But if you don't have a healthy gut, you don't have anything when it comes to your health.
Right.
We have found that autoimmune problems actually start in the GI tract. The origins of rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Graves' disease, type 1 diabetes, celiac disease start with an unhealthy GI tract. And autoimmune problems are largely not genetic. They're largely the environment. And nothing is more important than the environment of our gut, because when our GI tract's not healthy, we will definitely have more immune problems. So I want to stress that there's a myriad of problems that are out there that can be caused from your yeast overgrowth. And you may be thinking, I don't have yeast overgrowth. But if you have a chronic problem, there's a good chance it is connected. So how do you know you have yeast overgrowth? Well, if you've had antibiotics, you should assume you do, because you're going to get overgrowth of yeast. If you've taken any steroids, like for poison ivy, you should assume you have it, because steroids feed the yeast and it goes nuts. It just you have really rapid expansion of your yeast load when you take just one round, just for a week of steroids. If you take, if you've been on birth control pills, pregnancy increases yeast levels. So obviously, the more times you're pregnant, the more likely you have an increase in yeast just from that. So with all that, do you have yeast? It's pretty hard for you not to have yeast. And there's not a perfect test. I wish I had like with strep throat you can do a test, or with pregnancy you can do a simple test. We don't have that with yeast. But what we can see is the results of what happens when you get rid of the yeast. People see their improvement. Certain symptoms are more suggestive of yeast, but basically if you're not well and you've had antibiotics, we should do this yeast cleanse together. So first and foremost, we need to cut out the white starchy foods, because if you're feeding the yeast, their defenses are up. And by the way, speaking of defenses, there's a lot of reasons why it's hard to get rid of yeast. One of them is they actually hide under this layer called a biofilm, and they're actually kind of hiding from the things your body does to try to get rid of it. And then on top of that, these candida make things that go after the good bacteria in your body. So once you have it, they actually start killing off the friendly bacteria themselves. Do you remember how we discovered the penicillin, which is actually produced by a mold, which again is in the same family as yeast? It was in a petri dish, and the bacteria around it couldn't grow because it was making the substance, which thankfully Sir Alexander Fleming did the research and said, you know what, that looks like that could be useful, and that's where penicillin came from. Well, you have your own body making these type of these antibiotics basically in your GI tract. So you've got alcohol going on, you've got antibiotics, and they're being made inside of your body now. So to get rid of it, stop feeding it. A lot of folks find if they've ever done something in the low carb genre where they cut out all sugars and starches, they go, gosh, I just feel better. Part of what's going on when they're doing that is they're not feeding their candida, so it's not overgrowing. So cut out the white starchy foods, sugar, of course, high fructose corn syrup, any flour, and a lot of people think whole grain is okay, but actually it's still very sugary. So cut out all flour, and that's just a few things in the store: bread, pasta, pizza, cereal, cakes, cookies, crackers, tortillas, chips. So
anything processed, basically, if it comes in a package and man made it.
And you've heard people say shop on the outside of the grocery store, and that's basically because the middle of the store is packed with these things that are simple sugars and processed.
Right.
If it can sit in a box for a long period of time and not be refrigerated, it's a faux food, and you really want to stay away from it. So the other issues with things that feed yeast are going to be, watch out, fruit juice is very sugary. Milk, a lot of people forget that milk has lactose. So even if you're drinking skim milk, that's sugar. Potato and rice are eliminated month 1, as well as a few other things like lima beans. Of course, baked beans because sugar's added. A few other veggies are avoided, but those are the big ones, those white starchy ones. And when you avoid those, the yeast will stop growing. Think of them as just growing when you feed them. And then when you deprive them of what they need, they shrink up into what's called a spore. And now they're just sitting there. Now we can actually make some progress because now they've dropped their defenses. And the way we get rid of it is with some prescription items. We often use nystatin and later fluconazole, but fortunately, we have some powerful over-the-counter tools that anyone can pick up downstairs and really make progress with knocking out their candida. We have the natural yeast cleanse, which is filled with some natural things that help kill the yeast, and the probiotics to put in the good bacteria. So basically, what we try to do over a 3-month period is pull up the yeast. Imagine a yard with lots of weeds. That's what we're doing here. Pulling up the weeds, getting rid of that yeast. And as we do that, we don't want to leave a void. We're planting grass seeds so that what we're going to have after 3 months is a very healthy lawn. And we also have some additional tools, by the way, that you can pick up in physician's preference, something called interface, which dissolves that protective layer that the yeast like to hide behind. Now, not everybody needs that, but if you're having a problem with it not clearing up, if you take the interface with the probiotics and the natural yeast cleanse, you'll get even better results. And colostrum can also boost the immune system. We have Colostrum Complete, which is a great product for knocking out candida.
Right. Well, and now when that yeast starts kind of shriveling up, that's how I'm envisioning it, something else happens, and it starts releasing some toxins that I know we refer to it commonly as die-off.
Right. The first person to describe this was a guy named Herxheimer, and so he often gets credit, and people sometimes say you're herxing, but the yeast die-off symptoms or herxing is common with anything where you knock out an infection or detox the body. The Herxheimer reaction can feel like a headache, feeling tired, a rash, and it's usually a symptom that you have bothering you anyway, but it comes back when you get rid of the yeast. Now, a lot of people build that up to be worse than it is. It's actually sometimes mild, and some people feel so much better when they start getting the yeast to stop producing the bad stuff, and they avoid the foods that they're reacting to, which are often the ones we eliminate, like wheat and dairy, that they actually feel better. So I don't want people to think it's harder than it is. And if you do have problems with yeast die-off, there are several steps that you can take. One is you can back off on the yeast killer you're taking, like the natural yeast cleanse. You can take Nutritabs, which is sodium bicarbonate, which calms down the reaction. And there's other things as well. You can take a psyllium or fiber. Bentonite clay can be used, which helps bind the toxins. But there are things you can do so it's tolerable, because we understand that everybody has to function. Usually you can't say, time out, I'm going to do a yeast cleanse and nobody bother me for a certain period of time. So we can help you with that. But the bottom line is getting rid of yeast is an investment in your health that will pay off the rest of your life, because the exciting thing about doing this is when you finish, it doesn't come back. If you eat healthy and stay away from antibiotics, it'll often stay away. Now, you might need to do this from time to time, and that's why a lot of folks like every January to start January off with a yeast cleanse, just to get rid of any that might have built up before it becomes obvious it's there. And that's reasonable to do. But basically, once you get it out of your system, the wonderful thing is people will often stay at a much higher state of health.
Right. And something that I know it happened for me, and many of our guests report that their cravings for that food that feeds the yeast, it just goes away. It's like the yeast isn't there wanting to be fed. So their cravings for breads and sugars, it's under control.
And, you know, people underestimate how much they can change their cravings. I think one mental barrier to doing the yeast cleanse is telling yourself, there is no way I could live a month without whatever it is. And by the way, we also need folks to avoid beer and wine the first month, which is sometimes the challenge, because folks who drink wine every day tend to feel pretty strongly about that. If you eat bread every day, you can feel really strongly about that as well. But give yourself more credit for being flexible, because people can change, and I'm surprised how often I hear the words, it was so much easier than I thought. And it's because they weren't giving themselves credit for being able to change their daily routine as much as they really can.
Right. And so it just, what do they say? It takes 21 days to change a habit. And even just small changes, starting to make those small changes goes a long way towards your overall health. But committing for that 30 days, I mean, we could do almost anything for 30 days, right?